Sign here, Dad. It's just to protect you. You don't want the government taking everything you worked for, do you? That was what my son-in-law said with that polished smile of his, while my daughter sat across the table, not quite meeting my eyes. 3 weeks later, he called me 38 times in a single day. But by then, I had already made my decision, and it wasn't the one either of them expected. My name is Chester Boyd. I'm 68 years old, and I spent 37 years as an electrician in Knoxville, Tennessee. Not the kind of job people make movies about. No one writes songs about a man who crawls through attic insulation in August or lies flat on his back under a double-wide tracing a short circuit at midnight. But honest work has its own dignity, and I never once doubted mine. My hands know the difference between a wire that'll hold and one that'll burn. Turns out, I wasn't as good at spotting the same difference in people. My wife Loretta passed 26 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 4 months after diagnosis, and she made it 7. That was Loretta. Always did things on her own schedule. We'd been married 41 years, and I won't pretend those last 7 months weren't the hardest thing I've ever lived through. Watching someone you love disappear a little more each week while you stand there holding a cup of soup she can't eat anymore. There aren't words for that kind of helplessness. When she finally went, on a Tuesday morning in March with rain hitting the window and her hand in mine, I felt like I'd been turned inside out. My daughter Paige was there. She'd flown in from Phoenix, and I was grateful for that. She and her husband Neil had been married 8 years by then. Neil was in commercial real estate, the kind of man who always had a deal cooking, always talked about leverage and upside potential like he was hosting a podcast. I never disliked him exactly, but I never fully trusted him either, and I always felt a little ashamed of myself for it, like I was being an ungrateful father-in-law. After the funeral, Paige started calling more often. At first it felt like what it looked like, a daughter checking on her grieving father. Then the question shifted. Dad, have you thought about what you're doing with the house? Dad, you know that property on Clover Ridge Road is worth something now with all the development out that way. Dad, Neil thinks we should sit down and talk through your finances before something happens. I was 66 years old, in reasonable health, and nothing was happening. But grief does something to your judgment. It doesn't make you stupid. It makes you tired. It makes the thought of having other people handle things feel like relief instead of a warning sign. So when Paige suggested I come stay with them in Phoenix for a few months, just to get out of the house, just to have some company, I said yes. That was my first mistake. The second mistake came about 6 weeks into my stay. Neil spread papers across the kitchen table, one Sunday after dinner, very casual, like it was nothing. He explained that he'd been looking into estate planning on my behalf, as a gift, really, because these things get complicated, and he didn't want me to get caught with probate costs eating up what I'd built. He used words like trust transfer and designated beneficiary and stepped-up basis, and I understood maybe half of them. What I understood clearly was that Paige was watching me with an expression I now recognize as rehearsed concern. I signed 4 separate documents over 2 evenings. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself this is what you do when you're older, and your wife is gone, and your daughter is right there offering to help. I told myself Neil was family. What I didn't know was that Neil's real estate business had been hemorrhaging money for nearly 2 years. He'd over-leveraged on 3 commercial properties during the rate hikes and was facing margin calls he couldn't cover. One of his partners had already walked. The bank was making noises about calling in a line of credit, and my daughter, who knew all of this, had helped him look at my assets the way a drowning man looks at a life preserver. The property on Clover Ridge Road was 12 acres I'd bought with Loretta back in 1999 for $34,000. We'd always planned to build a small house there, eventually have some land, grow a garden, maybe keep a few chickens. We never got around to it. The land sat there all those years, mostly wooded, a creek running through the back third of it. I'd always thought of it as our Sunday place. After Loretta died, it became the place I couldn't think about without my chest hurting. According to the documents I'd signed, it was Neil's now, along with the proceeds from a savings account I'd had for 22 years, and the right to make financial decisions on my behalf under a power of attorney I had not understood I was granting. I found this out not from Neil or Paige, but from my neighbour back in Knoxville, a retired schoolteacher named Shirley, who'd collected my mail. and noticed a letter from the Knox County Property Records Office. She called me. I'm not sure Paige and Neil ever expected Shirley to call me. When I asked Paige about the property transfer, she went quiet for a moment in a way that told me everything. Then she said, "Dad," Neil explained all this. "You agreed it made sense to consolidate things." I asked her to show me the document where I'd agreed to transfer the deed. She said she'd have to ask Neil. Neil was suddenly very busy and would get back to me when he had a free moment. That was a Thursday. By Friday, I'd called a real estate attorney in Knoxville named Dennis Farlow, whose number Shirley had found for me. Dennis had a voice like a man who'd heard every version of this story and had stopped being surprised about 15 years ago. He asked me to overnight him copies of everything I'd signed. The following Monday, Dennis called me back. "Mr. Boyd," he said, "the power of attorney you signed was drawn up improperly. It's missing the required witness signatures under Tennessee law, which means it's not legally valid. The deed transfer also has a problem. It was filed in Knox County, but the notarization was performed in Arizona by a notary who isn't registered to notarize documents for Tennessee real property transactions. In plain language," he said, "your son-in-law tried to take your land and did a sloppy job of it." I sat in the guest bedroom of my daughter's house with that phone pressed against my ear and felt something go cold and clear inside me. Not rage exactly, more like the feeling you get when you've been trying to find a fault in a circuit for hours and you finally trace it back to the source. Everything makes sense. You know exactly what has to happen next. I didn't say anything to Paige and Neil that night. I ate dinner with them, watched the news, said goodnight. I needed to think, and I've always thought better with space around me. 2 days later, I told Paige I wanted to drive back to Knoxville for a few weeks, check on the house, take care of some things. She offered to come with me. I said I preferred to go alone. Something in my voice must have landed differently than usual, because she looked at me for a long moment before she said okay. The drive from Phoenix to Knoxville is about 24 hours if you push it. I took 3 days. I stopped at a diner in Amarillo and ate chicken fried steak and drank bad coffee and sat there for an extra hour just because I could. I stopped in Memphis and walked along the river. I hadn't done anything like that in years. Loretta always used to say, I moved through life too fast, always pointed at the next thing instead of standing still in the one I was already in. She would have liked that walk along the river. When I got back to Knoxville, Dennis and I met in his office for 2 hours. He'd already been in contact with the Knox County Recorder's Office and with a title company. Because the deed transfer was invalid, the property had never legally changed hands. It was still mine. The power of attorney was void. My savings account, it turned out, had not been fully transferred either. Neil had initiated the paperwork, but hadn't completed the process, possibly because the bank had flagged it for a secondary verification that required my in-person signature. What Neil had actually succeeded in doing was very little. What he'd tried to do was everything. I also found out, through Dennis and through a few phone calls I made myself, that Neil's situation was worse than I'd suspected. The commercial property deals had collapsed entirely. He owed one of his former partners over $180,000. His credit had been frozen, and the house Paige and Neil lived in, the one I'd been staying in as a guest, was 30 days away from a notice of default. Paige called me that first Friday back in Knoxville. "Just checking in," she said. "How's the house?" "Fine," I said. We talked for 11 minutes about nothing. I did not mention Dennis Farlow. The following Thursday, things changed. I don't know exactly what tipped them off. Maybe the title company contacted Neil as part of their process. Maybe someone at the bank said something. However it happened, my phone started ringing at 7:14 in the morning and did not meaningfully stop until after 10 o'clock that night. Neil called first. "Dad, I think there's been a misunderstanding about some paperwork." "Let me explain." I let it go to voicemail. Paige called 20 minutes later, her voice careful and even. "Dad, can you please just call us back? We're worried about you." Voicemail, then Neil again, then Paige. Then Neil from a different number I didn't recognize until he left a message, then Paige twice in a row. By noon I'd counted 19 missed calls. By the time I sat down to eat dinner that evening, it was 38. 38 calls in one day from the two people who'd sat across a kitchen table from me and watched me sign away everything I'd spent my life building. I turned my phone off, made myself a grilled cheese sandwich, and watched a baseball game. The Astros were playing the Braves. It went 11 innings. It was the best baseball game I'd watched in years. The next morning, I drove out to Clover Ridge Road. I hadn't been to the property in almost 3 years. The gravel turnoff was more overgrown than I remembered, and I had to ease my truck through a stand of cedar saplings that had come up since the last time. But the land itself was exactly as I'd left it. Maybe better. The woods were thick and quiet, the kind of quiet you only get when you're far enough from a road that the sound of traffic just stops. The creek in the back was running clear, maybe 6 or 8 inches deep, moving over smooth limestone the colour of old bone. I walked the whole 12 acres that morning. Took me almost 2 hours. I found the spot where Loretta and I had once spread a blanket and eaten sandwiches and talked about where we'd put the house if we ever built one. She'd wanted the porch facing east so she could have her coffee in the morning light. I stood there for a long time. On my way out, I stopped and talked to the man who owned the adjacent property, a farmer named Douglas, who'd lived out there for 30 years. He told me he'd been watching that land for a while, hoping it might come up for sale someday. I asked him why. He said a developer had been sniffing around the whole corridor for 18 months, buying up parcels. The county had recently approved a zoning change that opened the area to mixed residential and light commercial use. Parcels with road frontage and water features, he said, meaning creek access, were selling for between $12,000 and $18,000 an acre. I did the math standing in a field in my work boots. 12 acres, $12,000 at the low end, that was $144,000. At the high end, it was over $200,000 for land I'd bought for $34,000 25 years ago. Neil had called it a tax burden that needed to be managed. I drove back into Knoxville and called Dennis from the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel. I told him about Douglas and the developer and the zoning change. Dennis was quiet for a second, and then he said, "Mr. Boyd, I think you might want to talk to a real estate broker before you make any decisions. I know someone who knows this corridor well." 3 days later, I sat in a broker's office and listened to a woman named Patricia explain that parcels like mine were moving quickly and that she had 2 buyers she could call that afternoon. I told her to make the calls. I also called my nephew Scott, who's an accountant in Chattanooga and whose judgment I trust more than anyone else's since Loretta died. Scott came down that weekend and sat with me and Dennis and went through everything. He confirmed what Dennis had said. The documents Neil had prepared were legally void. My assets were intact, and the property, if I chose to sell, would generate more money than I'd made in my last 6 years of working. Neil showed up at my house on a Saturday morning about 10 days after the 38 calls. I hadn't returned a single one. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in 2 weeks, which was probably accurate. The confident commercial real estate man, with his deal talk and his leverage analysis, was gone. What stood on my front porch was a frightened person who'd run out of options and decided that his best remaining one was me. "Dad," he said, and the fact that he still called me that after everything struck me as almost funny. "Dad, I know things got out of hand. I made mistakes. I was desperate, and I made decisions I shouldn't have, and I'm asking you to let me explain." I stood in my doorway, and I looked at this man who had sat across a dinner table from me and called it estate planning. I thought about Loretta. I thought about what she would have said. Loretta was a kinder person than me by a long measure, but she was not a foolish one. She would not have told me to pretend this hadn't happened. "Neil," I said, "you didn't make a mistake. A mistake is when you miscalculate something. What you did was a choice. You looked at a grieving old man and you saw an opportunity. You got my daughter to help you do it, which is something I'm going to have to think about for a long time. But I want you to hear me clearly. That property is mine. That account is mine. And the power of attorney you tried to create isn't worth the paper it's printed on." His face was doing things I won't describe. He said, "Paige is devastated." She didn't understand what she was agreeing to. I said that was between him and Paige, and I wasn't the right person to help him work that out. I told him to go home. He stood there another minute, and then he did. I closed the door and stood in my hallway for a while. The house was quiet, the way it always is now. I've gotten used to it mostly, though there are still mornings when I reach over to Loretta's side of the bed before I'm fully awake. That particular kind of quiet never completely goes away. I sold 8 of the 12 acres to the developer 6 weeks later. I kept the 4 acres with the creek and the spot where Loretta wanted to put her east-facing porch. I'm building there now, not a big house. A small one, with good materials, properly wired, which I'm doing myself because some skills don't leave you. The porch faces east. The money from the sale covered more than I expected. I set some aside for my nephew Scott's kids' college funds because Scott showed up when I needed him, and that matters. I made a donation to the library system in Loretta's name because she loved libraries the way some people love churches. I paid Dennis Farlow very well for his work and told him so. The rest is in an account that only I can access, with in-person verification required for any significant transaction. I was a slow learner on that point, but I learned. Paige called me about a month after Neil's visit. The conversation was one of the hardest I've had since Loretta's hospital room, she cried. She said she hadn't fully understood what Neil was doing, and I don't know if that's true or if she's told herself that enough times that it feels true. The distance between those two things is something I think about. She's still my daughter. I still love her. But love and trust are different things, and I only have one of them left for her right now. Maybe with time the other one comes back. Maybe it doesn't. Neil, I've been told, is working through a debt restructuring. The house in Phoenix sold in foreclosure. They're renting an apartment now. I don't feel satisfaction about that exactly, but I don't feel sorry either. I feel something closer to neutral. The way you feel when a circuit finally goes dead and you know the dangerous current is no longer running. I'm writing this from the property on Clover Ridge Road. I have a camp chair set up near the creek and a thermos of coffee that's gone mostly cold because I've been sitting here longer than I planned. The leaves are just starting to turn. A heron landed on a rock about 20 feet from me 20 minutes ago and stood there absolutely still for so long. I started to think maybe it was something I'd imagined. Then it lifted off without any urgency at all, like it had simply decided it was finished with this particular place and was ready for the next one. I know how that feels. I'm 68 years old. I spent 37 years making sure other people's lights came on. I buried my wife on a rainy Tuesday and signed papers I shouldn't have because I was tired and sad and I trusted the wrong people. I lost 6 months in someone else's house in Arizona trying to grieve and instead getting robbed slowly, quietly by someone who called me dad. But I drove home on my own. I found a man I could trust in Dennis Farlow. I walked my 12 acres in my work boots and I remembered who I was. And I built a house on the piece of land where my wife once told me she wanted to drink her coffee in the morning light. She was right about the view. She was right about most things. If this story reached you, if any part of it felt familiar, I want you to know one thing. Grief doesn't make you weak. It makes you tired. And tired people make easier targets. But the land doesn't lie. The law doesn't lie. And the work of your own hands is something no one can take from you if you pay close enough attention. Don't sign anything you don't understand. Get a second opinion from someone who isn't related to you. And if someone calls what you've spent your life building a tax burden that needs to be managed, hold on to your wallet and walk toward the door. That's all an old electrician has for you. Stay sharp out there.